Welcome to the session tonight, everybody. We're really happy that you made the time to come and be here to learn about systematic screening here for our second Enhanced Empower session. My name is Mark Buckman, and we're really happy to host you here for the little webinar tonight. And yeah, we'll just jump straight into our content about systematic screening. So of course, we're going to be learning a little bit more about the Comprehensive Integrated Three-Tiered Model of Prevention, or Ci3T. As you're engaging in this presentation tonight, we'd love for you to engage with us on social media. So whatever your preferred platform is, be it Twitter or X or Instagram, you can always find us on those platforms, and we're trying to push out new information and tips and strategies and resources as time goes on. So we'd love for you to follow us and tweet us and chat with us in any social media platform that you like to use. And so as we're thinking about professional learning that you have access to this year, this is our Project Empower session, specifically the Enhanced Empower session. These are open to anyone that works in schools that we're working with as part of a research partnership this year. I'll give you a little bit more information about that research project in just a moment. But we encourage you to invite anybody and everybody at your school to attend these sessions because they're an opportunity for you to connect with educators from across the country engaging in this work. So if you have questions about Ci3T in any aspect, or if your colleagues have questions about Ci3T, we would love for them to come to these sessions to have a chance to chat with us and also chat with other people that are facing similar challenges and having similar successes and focused on similar work through that Ci3T model. The next sessions are going to be happening in November, and then we have sessions in the 2024 year as well in January, March, and April. So if you're looking for resources tonight that are related to the presentation, feel free to log on to ci3t.org/enhance. You can use the password enhance Ci3T !, all lowercase letters, to access the password protected page here, Project Enhance. It's the super secret location of all of our resources that we'll be sharing with you through the Project Enhance research projects that are ongoing. Again, I'll mention those in just a few minutes. But if you want the resources for tonight, you would scroll down towards the bottom of the page. You'll find some blue accordions for Project Empower resources. And like I mentioned, we're on session 2, and you're going to look for that light blue accordion because those are the resources for the 2023-2024 school year. If by chance you're interested, do know that in the dark blue accordions, you can actually find webinar versions of all of our sessions from last year as well. So if you're just dying to know about managing the acting out cycle, which is a really popular session that we do a little bit later in the year, and you can't wait for that session to come up this year, you by all means can access the webinar version. Again, it's in those dark blue accordions over there on the left. Anything that's there is fair game for you to use, so feel free to take a look. All right, so for tonight, we are going to do a quick review of Ci3T and then launch into getting a perspective on what is the function of systematic screening in Ci3T models of prevention. Once we do sort of an initial introduction to the topic of systematic screening, which is a really exciting part of the model, but also a place that people have a lot of questions, we're going to do a deeper dive into the interpretation of those data. And specifically, we're going to talk about how those data can tell us about school-wide functioning, which is a really nice way to look at how behavioral performance within a building is changing over the course of a year or even over the course of multiple years. We'll talk about some decision-making models for what school leaders and classroom teachers can do when they're finding that kids in their class or kids in their grade level or kids in their school have a higher proportion of risk than what you would hope to see based on what we anticipate. So the first avenue to go when you start finding those kinds of challenges is going to be to delve into ways we can intensify or amplify tier 1 supports using things that we call low intensity supports. So we'll talk about what that might look like and connect you to resources there as well. And then the third block of that section is going to be going into sort of the classical use for systematic screening data, which is connecting students to secondary or tier 2 or tertiary tier 3 interventions. So more intensive supports that are only for some students who show those elevated risk levels. So again, we'll tell you about some interventions that you might connect students to and also connect you with resources. The last brief section will be to introduce some additional resources beyond just the Ci3T resources, so that you can learn more about picking a screener, talking with your families and community members about systematic screening and its purpose in Ci3T models, as well as a host of other topics. And then we'll wrap up briefly by letting you know about what's coming up next in terms of professional development. So as we get started, we would encourage you to pull up your school's Ci3T implementation manual, and we'll try to make some links to that manual as we go through this first section, so that what we're talking about, you can always kind of link through to what you're actually doing in your school across the 3 tiers of prevention. As we kind of think about Ci3T and where we've been as a field in education over the past 30 years or so, Ci3T is one kind of integrated tiered system of support. And this work has been going on for quite a long time, dating back to the 90s when Kathleen Lane and Holly Menzies started doing integrated multi-tiered systems of support, specifically calling it Ci3T. And what's cool about this is that Ci3T was a thing before the term multi-tiered system of support even existed. So this was like one of the original efforts to pull together teams looking at academic data, teams looking at behavioral data, and teams looking at social and emotional data, and putting it into one place and doing that in a coordinated, integrated manner. So that was truly a really innovative way to look at doing prevention and intervention work in schools that since then has caught on to be a national phenomenon in terms of how we think about, multi-tiered system of support is a pretty common terminology in education now. So we can think about Ci3T as one of the focal and origin points of that conception of how we can use that tiered model. And then recently, what our research team has been doing is focusing on how to help people do this work. It's complex work. When you think about Ci3T, you may think of one of several different things in terms of maybe you're thinking about the expectation posters or tickets or check-in, check-out interventions or using data, and all of those by all means are part of the model. But there's a lot that goes into it, and it all has to work in concert for it to really have the effect that you want in your school. So with that in mind, we realized that schools needed a lot of professional development resources to help train people, build capacity, both in leadership and in terms of just individual classroom teachers, even classified staff like paraprofessionals. Everybody needs to be on the same page about how to engage in practices related to the Ci3T model. So Project Enhance was conceptualized to figure out what kinds of professional development resources were needed, and to start building those resources and testing them to see, if having really amplified training opportunities could produce better outcomes in schools doing this work. So basically what we're doing right now is schools that are in the enhanced condition of a current study that's happening right now are able to come to these sessions to learn about some of the professional learning resources that we've been developing, and to start figuring out how to use those in your classrooms or your context as well. And so we're really excited to share those resources with you tonight, or some of those resources. There's so many that we couldn't fit them into one session. We have a whole year's worth of sessions to try to cover as much of those as we can. So then linking through to the focus of tonight's session, which is systematic screening. When we think about Ci3T, I think the first thing I would say to describe it is it's a data-informed model. And specifically what we mean by data-informed is we have these 3 tiers, right? Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And what we want to do is figure out which level of intervention or prevention is appropriate for each student's level of need. And when we think about Tier 1, that's not for some kids. Tier 1 is for every single student in the building. It's the experience that we want to build for them, the instructional goals and objectives that we're trying to build into the school day for all students. And that encompasses academic needs, behavioral needs, and social and emotional well-being needs as well. And then when we think about kids who might need a little bit more in terms of instruction on academic skills or a little bit more behavioral intervention support, that's where Tier 2 comes into play. Typically, you'd expect about 15% of students in a school to need some additional support in at least one of those domains. And so that's where we're thinking about Tier 2. And we'll kind of break down what Tier 2 means here in a few minutes, but it doesn't necessarily mean a small group pullout. It doesn't mean kids being pulled out of school or pulled out of class to go to the counselor's office or to go to an academic interventionist. It certainly can mean that, but Tier 2 oftentimes is happening in the classroom by intensifying Tier 1 supports. We're doing teacher-led interventions as well. So just knowing that Tier 2 is a pretty broad bucket of potential interventions is useful to keep in mind from the forefront. And then lastly, we've got Tier 3, and Tier 3 is reserved for students with the most significant or intensive intervention needs. Tier 3 often is going to encompass multiple people in the school working together and collaborating in terms of planning intervention supports, collecting data, doing some additional wraparound services, potentially even to the community mental health or community behavioral health service providers, and then doing really intensive academic interventions as well. Because we want to make sure that regardless of the needs that students come to school with, that at our school, we want to have a plan to meet any need that might show up, because that's our charge as educators, is to support all students. So that is the intention of the model, is to be capable of meeting those needs and to always be sure that we can figure out who needs what kind of support. So systematic screening is going to provide one of the important data sources for us to make those decisions. So I mentioned this a little bit before, but when we think about what Tier 1 consists of, it's important just to have a pretty broad sense. Tier 1 is going to include a variety of supports, including validated academic curricula and programs, social and emotional programs to do things like violence prevention or conflict resolution, as well as to instruct on social skills that might be important both in the school setting and in the community setting as well. And Tier 1 is also going to include school-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports, which is a way of teaching expectations to students and acknowledging them for meeting those expectations, amongst some other features as well. And we hope that about 80% of students are going to respond to Tier 1, and that will be all they'll need at any given time. But that said, we certainly expect that Tier 1 is not going to be enough for everyone. There is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach to education, and this kind of model acknowledges that in its very foundational conception. So that's why we need to figure out what can we do for those students who just need a little bit more. Basically, we tend to think of students who maybe need a little bit of additional support as having one of several challenges, potentially a combination of these challenges, but specifically, kids tend to have trouble acquiring new skills. These are problems that students currently cannot do. So for example, if you've got students who can't currently decode CVC words, right? It doesn't matter how many M&Ms I give that kid. They're never going to be able to decode those words because they just haven't learned that skill yet. So we can identify those types of challenges and we can address them through further instruction, differentiation, intensive or more additional like remedial intervention and things like that. There are other students who have fluency difficulties, and these are kids who can sometimes perform a skill, but not consistently. And for those kids, we probably need to do a combination of additional reteaching, but also potentially reinforcing behaviors more frequently to help them happen more often. And that links me through to the performance concerns. So students who have performance challenges, they know how to do a skill, but they just don't consistently do it, and to a level above and beyond those kids with fluency challenges. These are kids who, when they, for example, act out, and you ask them what they should have done, they can tell you what they should have done. They just don't always do it. And this can be one of the more difficult challenges for teachers to address, because it's frustrating when kids know what they should do, they're just not choosing to do that. And so understanding that that's sort of the issue at hand, we can start from that point and say, okay, what can we do to make it more likely for that kid to engage in the desired behaviors and expected school-wide expectations, or potentially even to, do academic skills more consistently that they're just not doing yet. Oftentimes that's a question of readjusting like reinforcement contingencies, which might include using things like behavior specific praise or your school's universal reinforcement system, or potentially giving them more opportunities to access adult attention as they're working on those specific skills. So we'll get more into the details of Tier 2 in a little bit. But before we move through that, I want to make sure we touch on Tier 3, which are the most intensive interventions. Typically, this is going to be for just about 3 to 5% of students who really need that most intensive level of support. Sometimes that estimate can go up to 7%. And this encompasses students who have academic, behavioral, and or social and emotional needs. And what these interventions might look like are things called functional assessment-based interventions, which are thoroughly data informed. They involve a lot of data collection to identify what the specific challenge is and why that challenge continues to occur, and then to develop a specific individualized intervention to support that student. So these interventions tend to be individualized. I think that's the most descriptive word that we can use. And as you would expect, right? Students that have intensive challenges, we need to make sure that we're paying specific attention to individual needs. So again, just to rehash quickly, Tier 1 is for all students. It's going to consist of high quality academic standards and instruction, school-wide expectations through positive behavioral interventions and supports, and also social and emotional learning curricula such as positive action, second step, character strong, and other programs of the like. Tier 2 interventions are going to, I thought we were covering Tier 2, but we're just jumping straight to the Ci3T manuals. So when you think about your Ci3T intervention or implementation manual, excuse me, this is going to be the place that we're going to go to learn thoroughly what Tier 1 consists of, and also will contain information about the other tiers as well. One of the things that you would find in your implementation manual are faculty and staff roles and responsibilities. So for example, this is what we're going to be doing at Tier 1 to support students' academic and behavioral need. One of the things that you might find here, and this is sort of planting a seed that we'll come back to later tonight, are low intensity strategies. And so low intensity strategies are easy to perform teaching practices that we can do that are going to increase student engagement and decrease the likelihood of challenging behavior from happening. Some of these practices include behavior-specific praise, active supervision, free correction, instructional choice, and opportunities to respond. These are really, really critical to implementation of Ci3T for a variety of reasons, one of which is that they actually show up in a lot of Tier 2 interventions as well. So these are cool practices that we want to get really good at because they thread through the tiers and they can help us regardless of what our role is in a school, whether we be a general education teacher or an interventionist. We're going to be using these practices across the tiers. So we want to become very familiar with those. So as we think about screening data and how we're going to respond to screening data, almost certainly one of the ways we're going to respond is with some of these strategies, whether it be on their own or embedded into a Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention. So we're going to keep coming back to this list of strategies throughout the night and provide a lot of resources and information about where you can go to learn more about those strategies. In terms of behavior, that Tier 1 plan is going to have sort of a playbook or reactive plan for how to respond when challenging behavior occurs. This is in response to the fact that we don't expect prevention efforts to be successful 100% of the time. Students are going to sometimes have challenges, and so we want to make sure people know exactly what they should do to respond to those challenges. So a reactive plan is going to help us to figure out which behaviors are more minor behaviors that can be managed in the classroom, and which behaviors are more major and might be necessary to run through the office or some additional support staff to manage. But the end result of either of those behavior challenges is going to be figuring out what we can do to prevent that behavior from happening in the future, or at least to make it less likely to happen in the future, and always having constructive responses to those challenging behaviors. It does not mean by any means that there's not going to be some consequences to the acting out behavior that occurs, but it does mean it's going to be in a constructive manner. It's always going to have an instructive outcome. We're going to teach students what they need to know to hopefully avoid that challenging situation in the future. And of course, we want to make sure, and you'll find information in your Ci3T plan about how to teach those social and emotional lessons, whether that be second step or positive action or character strong. Knowing how often and when to teach those lessons is important because that's how we teach students those really foundational character skills, relationship skills, positive decision-making skills, and the like. So that's a really important feature of the plan as well. Additionally, in your Ci3T plan, you'll find information about procedures for teaching, which is how you all as faculty and staff can be taught about the plan. For example, coming to a session like this tonight, as well as teaching students and community members about the plan as well. You'll also find information about procedures for reinforcing, which is how we change behavior in the school, right? We need to change our own behavior to follow the plan and implement it successfully. And we can do that through reinforcing the behavior of our colleagues and the people that we work with. And also reinforcing student behavior through using things like behavior-specific praise. And lastly, procedures for monitoring, which is the important one because procedures for monitoring is all about collecting and using data to inform instruction and also at the school level to inform professional learning for adults. And so that's where systematic screening is going to come into play. Now, before we move into a full deep dive on systematic screening, just to cover a few last pieces of that Tier 1 experience for students, there's a lot there in terms of academic instruction, behavioral interventions, and behavioral expectation instruction, and teaching those social skills to students as well. And the real trick here is to not silo those and say, this is the time we do academic instruction, this is when we teach behavior, and this is when we teach social skills, but rather to make this all an integrated experience for students in our classroom throughout the school day. So an example of what this can look like is something called an integrated lesson plan, which is not necessarily something you would do for every lesson that you teach, but more so as you develop your skills and figuring out how to make your behavioral expectations play nice with your academic instruction and how to bring your social skill instruction to life in every moment in the classroom. This just gives you a very planful and purposeful way to merge all of those efforts together as you're just giving instruction in the classroom. So for example, when you're giving a lesson and you're about to tell them what the academic objective is, building in a social objective for peer cooperation or for showing empathy to students who express different perspectives on something, that is one thing we can do so that we're not responding to challenges by providing corrections constantly. Instead, we're being proactive and telling students one of the very goals of our lesson today is to engage in these social skills. And we can do the same thing with our expected behaviors. Maybe it's being respectful during instruction by raising your hand if you want to contribute, and maybe it's by being a learner by giving best effort throughout the lesson. But showing students all of those objectives on equal footing helps to make it clear that we're prioritizing not just the academic skills, but rather our behavioral and social skills as well. So I mentioned there are some additional data that are looked at. Systematic screening is what we're focused on tonight. And we like systematic screening because it helps us to think about how behavioral performance is shifting in the school. However, we don't want to look at those data by themselves because basically student behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Student behavior in many cases is contingent on a lot of things. It's the community where students come from. How well individual students are doing. Like, are they sleeping well? Are they well fed? Are they in a good place in their lives? But the school environment also has a pretty strong impact on what student behavior looks like. And so as we think about what the school environment is, a lot of that's derived from our Ci3T plan, right? That is sort of what we're doing in planning what that environment is supposed to look like. So what we want to do is we want to have some insight on how that environment is being established for students. So how our Ci3T implementation plan is actually implemented so that we understand, hey, if we're putting this plan into place as we planned it, we're doing a really good job implementing it, then we really should see that student behavioral performance is going to shift over time. But if we haven't quite gotten there yet, right, if we have a lot of issues where we're not quite implementing all the plan as consistently as we want to, we might not expect to see as much shift in behavioral performance because we haven't quite hit our stride with the plan yet. So this is a sort of a logic model that we'll keep going back to. But what we want to tell you about are these two data sources that speak to that issue of how is implementation going so that we can understand student outcomes. So social validity is a way of saying, how do people feel about the plan? Because when people feel positively about a plan, they're more likely to put it in place. So we want to get people's perspective on how they're feeling about the plan and what they're being asked to do as part of the plan. Additionally, there's treatment integrity data, which are going to tell us how well the plan is actually being put into place. And we see these two data sources, social validity and treatment integrity, as side by side, influencing each other. And when the plan is thought positively of by the people responsible for putting it into place, people are more likely to use the plan. And when people are using the plan more often, we're more likely to see those student outcomes shift in the direction that we want. And the inverse can be true as well. If people are struggling with the plan because they just can't see the point of it, or they feel like they're being asked to do things that they can't really fit into their school day, or they're struggling to understand how something is supposed to work, then they're going to be less likely to put the plan in place. And if they're not putting the plan into place, we're probably not going to see those shifts in student outcomes. So I hope that's a good illustration of why we want to look at all these data together. And even though we're focused on systematic screening data, we always want to kind of step back and also think about how we should interpret that in terms of what's happening within the school environment as well. And then, as we're thinking about if we're doing a great job implementing our plan, and we know that fidelity is really high, treatment integrity is really high, but students are still going to have some challenges at school. We want to be ready for responding to those challenges as well. And that's why we're going to have things like secondary tier 2 intervention grids, which show up in your school's plan that will list as a kind of a catalog of interventions that are available to implement for those students that are showing a little bit higher risk. So as you're thinking about tier 2 and tier 3 interventions tonight, we hope that you'll refer back to your school's intervention or your school's implementation plan and find those tier 2 and tier 3 grids so that you can familiarize with what kinds of interventions are available in your school. And then as we get to the end of the session tonight, you can think about whether you have access to resources that we'll share with you tonight for potentially implementing those interventions without needing any additional support, because you actually will have everything you need right there in those enhancing Ci3T professional learning modules, which we're going to introduce to you tonight. And the same is true of tier 3. We've got additional resources that you can check out for learning about tier 3 interventions that show up in your school's plan. So now we're ready to really jump full on into systematic screening as a practice. So we're going to start by guiding you to ci3t.org/screening, where if you'd like to, you can find a lot of information about screening tools, one of which that's pretty common is called the SRSSIE. And that's the one we're going to be going into the most detail on tonight. You can scroll down on some accordions that show up in that page, and the first one that you'll find is about the SRSSIE. And what you'll find there is that you can actually just download this tool as an Excel sheet. And if you wanted to screen students in your class, potentially you could do that using that spreadsheet. However, if you're attending this here tonight, that's because you're working in a school that's already implementing you're already implementing Ci3T, and your district has a really well-constructed data transfer method for collecting these data and summarizing them in your school. So you don't have to download this spreadsheet, but it is nice to just see the bones of the tool are very, very simple. So you're going to respond to these items, and the sum scores of those items are going to tell us at what risk level students might be for internalizing behaviors and externalizing behaviors. So at the elementary school level, those cut scores are published on the screening tab of the website. And for the externalizing scale, and again, externalizing behaviors are aggressive behaviors, acting out behaviors, things that get people's attention. You can see those cut scores there for both moderate and high risk. And then for the internalizing scale, with internalizing meaning more shy, anxious, and withdrawn behaviors, those cut scores are there as well. And there's a different set of cut scores for middle and high school students with a slightly different scoring structure. So the beauty of this tool is it can be used in a couple of different ways. And one of the ways we can look at it is just summarizing a whole school in one simple graphic like this one. So what this is showing you is the percentages of students at low, moderate, and high risk across, I think this is like 8 or 9 years of implementation, which is so cool because we can see this school's journey over time from when they started implementing Ci3T all the way to the current moment. And it kind of gives us a sense for how the school's journey is going, right? They started with a pretty high level of risk. You can see over on the far left, only 63% of students were at that low risk category in 2014. And if we come all the way down to 2022, we're up to that 80% threshold that we were hoping for. So it took this school some time to get there, but such a cool way to celebrate the work that's being done over a long period of time to see that kind of growth. And then you can also see on this graph, which is for internalizing behaviors, a similar pattern over time as the school has engaged in this work to support students with both internalizing and externalizing behaviors. You can also look at these data and kind of drill a little bit further down to find those students across grade levels or see potentially where pockets of risk might be emerging for different grade levels or age groups. So like in this particular example, we can see that second grade has a little bit lower percentage of students at that low risk level. So we might be thinking about maybe some additional supports that we could push into that second grade since they're showing a little bit elevated risk compared to the other grade levels. And if you're asking yourself, okay, so it's cool that this tool exists, but like, why should I trust the scores on the tool? We want to share just some research that's been done. There is an incredible plethora of research that's been done on the validity and reliability of the SRSSIE, particularly over the past 5 or 6 years. The tool has a lot of evidence to show both the internalizing and the externalizing scores are extremely helpful for making some decisions about what kinds of needs students might have. And we want to focus on one particular study right now that exemplifies what I mean by this. So what you're looking at here is a table that shows academic performance in the terms of oral reading fluency and map reading, and then some behavioral outcomes, which we're calling nurse visits and in-school suspensions. And then what you see here are kids at low risk, the scores on this outcome measure for those kids in that category, and then the same for moderate and high risk. So what's really interesting, this is a pretty big sample of students. And what we found was for both behavioral and academic outcomes, there are significant differences between students that are in the low risk, moderate risk, and high risk category. And it's not just behavior, it's academic as well. So specifically, what this is telling us is that students that are in the low risk category at the beginning of the year in externalizing behavior are likely to score significantly higher on reading measures at the end of the year than students both in the moderate and high risk category. And so this tells us that even students at moderate risk, we want to pay attention to that because that moderate risk level is predictive of lower academic outcomes at the end of the year, as well as behavioral outcomes as well. So kids that are at the moderate risk or high risk levels are more likely to be to receive those in-school suspensions than students in the low risk category. And then the same thing is that, or a similar thing is true for internalizing behaviors. So the relationship between academic scores and internalizing behavior is a little bit less dramatic. What we found was that students in the low risk category are predicted to have significantly higher scores in reading than students in the moderate and high risk, but there's not as much of a difference between moderate risk and high risk for students. So basically the difference there is not significant. But this still tells us that any amount of risk for internalizing behaviors is worth noting because those students with even moderate risk are scoring at a statistically significant lower level than students at low risk. And then students for nurse visits, across the spectrum there, students at low risk, moderate risk, and high risk are significantly different from each other. So kids that have high internalizing needs or even moderate internalizing needs, they're missing a little bit more class time to go to the nurse, for example, which we know is kind of a feature of internalizing behaviors as students make those somatic complaints, my stomach hurts, my head hurts, and that can cause them to miss instruction and potentially that could influence those academic scores as well. And so as we're thinking about what this would look like in middle schools and high schools, we can see that by looking at that school level, we have a really good sense for what the school environment is doing in terms of supporting those those behavioral needs. And it gives us an opportunity to think about what we need to do to respond to that. So the slides that I showed you before were for elementary school students, very similar outcomes for middle and high school students as well in terms of externalizing behavior and internalizing behavior, predicting both academic and behavioral outcomes as well. There are a bunch of different ways to look at screening data, and we'll look at some more of those in the next slide. But a bunch of different schools have taken these data and kind of looked at them in their own fashion to help break down and analyze them. And we definitely suggest that that's a good idea because it lets people get their hands on the data and start making some of these preliminary decisions and interpretations. But the real important thing is as these data are being collected, because they are predictive and valuable for making those student decisions about interventions that they might receive, we do want to make sure that they get shared out to faculty and staff. So if you're interested in seeing your school's graphs like this, you likely do have them, and you can always talk to your school's Ci3T implementation or your school's Ci3T leadership team to find access to your systematic screening data. Or hopefully you're having opportunities during your faculty and staff meetings to review these data in a presentation format. And so we actually have resources available on our website to create these cool like pyramid triangle graphs so that you can look at your data over time and share them back with people, or hopefully in your shoes as an implementer at your school to review those data as well. If you're interested in finding where those graphs and data sharing tools are, you can always check out the Systematic Screening Ci3T website for more information. And we also have additional resources on how to set up the screener at your school. So if you're someone that's interested in like making a more robust system for collecting data, we have this very cool ebook that we'll share later tonight in our session about that topic as well. So now we're going to pause for just a few minutes and we're going to have a chance to talk through some of these issues about systematic screening, including what the potential benefits of screening are, what potential challenges you might run into, and what questions you might have. And we'll come back in 15 minutes and continue and pick it up from there. Okay, thanks so much for that great discussion. As we jump into the next section of the presentation, let's talk about how to interpret these data. So there are three main ways that we can look at these data. And the first one is going to be to think about what the implications are for Tier 1 instruction. So I want to show you a graph. And this is an older graph from a different tool. So this is not the SRS SIE, but the information provided is pretty similar. And basically what you're seeing here is the proportion of students that have low, moderate, and high risk scores for motivation to learn and pro-social behavior. And what we're noticing in this graph is that those proportions are pretty low, right? We're kind of under that 60% level, and the hoped for level is 80% for students who are in that low risk category. So when we think about what to do with that, there's a temptation to say, oh my God, we need a ton of tier 2 and tier 3 resources to come to the rescue. And although that certainly makes a certain amount of sense, the really important thing to recognize is that those resources are probably not going to necessarily be available to do that level of tier 2 and tier 3 interventions, one. And number two is, if we're finding that percentage of students' needs aren't being met in tier 1, we really need to take a hard look at what the tier 1 experience looks like and figure out what we can do to intensify it or to tailor it to our students' needs. Because the reality is that as wonderful as many tier 2 and tier 3 interventions are, if those interventions aren't evidenced like all the way throughout the school day or in the full school context, it's going to be really hard to move the needle for those students. And if you have so many different tier 2 and tier 3 interventions, like how do you put all those into action at the same time? It really becomes almost unviable at some point. And so we really need to step back and think, okay, what can we do at the tier 1 level to at least start to meet this need? This does not mean that we're not going to do any tier 2 or tier 3 intervention by any means. That's not what it means. But it does mean we at least have to start with saying, what can we do with tier 1 to make it more appropriate and more aligned to the needs of our students. Now, contrast that with the graph that looks like this, where we can see in the past, we would have been making some decisions to say, if only 63% of our student needs are being met by tier 1, we really got to take a hard look at what tier 1 looks like and figure out how to increase our implementation or potentially add on some additional practices that are going to be aligned to those students' needs. But as we've moved through time, maybe that work has been super successful. And as we get more towards that 2022 school year, where we've got 80% of students' needs being met at tier 1, this is the time to say, oh my goodness, our tier 1 is really doing its job wonderfully. The expected or hoped for percentage of students' needs are being met. And now we're really ready to move forward with tier 2 and tier 3 interventions. So when this becomes the case, it's cause for huge celebration, and it also really helps you to say, okay, we know where we need to put our focuses and resources now. It's into tier 2 or tier 3. Whereas the other school is saying, we know where we need to put our focus and resources. It's into tier 1. And sometimes you even find schools that are, their data look more like this, and it's almost too good to be true. But, when you've got nearly every student in the school whose needs are being met at tier 1, there are so many benefits to that. It means most students are being successful, and it also really enables you to put a ton of resources and focus and attention on supporting those students with more intensive intervention needs. So it really opens up a whole new world of possibility in terms of supporting those students that do have that elevated need. Not that these are necessarily expected results, by the way. So, we always want to kind of keep a realistic perspective on there's going to be students who need extra support. And it's not always going to look like this, but we can certainly get ourselves closer to a place where those proportions are manageable if we can figure out how to make that tier 1 experience as robust as possible, which is a big ask. But we do have some solutions and some ideas for what you can do to move forward if you find yourself in that position in a school that really needs to figure out how can we make our tier 1 as robust as possible. So one of the ways that we can do that is to empower teachers with low intensity supports. So this is where we're going to be jumping full on into the enhancing Ci3T modules. So this is a really cool infographic that we, members of our team, have developed to help explain what these modules look like and how they can be used. So just so you kind of get a sense for what this looks like. Every single module that's on the ci3t.org/enhance page has both an ebook component and an interactive resource component. What you're looking at here is the ebook version of that module. And it has a really incredible organizational structure that will help you to get to the information that you need. Inside the ebook, you'll find a link, which down here is, you can see it on the lower half of your screen, where you can access the interactive resource version of the module. And the interactive resource is basically going to be a more multimedia-based version of the same content that you would find in the ebook. So what you have is sort of a choose-your-own-adventure way of saying, would I rather read this content or would I rather watch and experience this content? And maybe you'd like to do it both ways. You might start by reading and then by watching, or start by watching and then go back and find in the book the things that you want to return to or go a little bit deeper on. But there's multiple different ways you can choose to interact with those resources. So to kind of illustrate what sort of modules exist, I mentioned the low intensity supports, and we have an entire section of modules that are focused on these supports. So each of the 7 strategies, which are behavior specific praise, instructional choice, active supervision, high probability request sequences, instructional feedback, opportunities to respond, and pre-correction. Each one has an extensive module that's going to go through all these resources and provide all this instruction on how to get this in place in the classroom. So if you were a teacher and you were looking at your class data and it looked kind of like this, where this is an example of how to look across multiple sources of data, reading, math, behavior. And this is a class that has quite a bit of need. Each of those yellow and red cells represent an area where a student is at moderate or high risk. And that teacher might be saying, oh my goodness, like I don't even know where to start looking at these data. Like, what should I do first? And oftentimes the place to go is to start thinking about how to make that tier 1 experience more robust for students. So as we're thinking about low intensity strategies as the vehicle to do that, one thing that schools will often do is they'll make a list of expertise in the building, basically finding who are the people that are pros at behavior specific praise, experts in opportunities to respond, and coaches for instructional choice, or people that are really good at these strategies. And when you put together a warehouse of like, okay, I need help learning this strategy, or I need help learning all of the strategies, how do I get started? Having a person to go to start that conversation is invaluable. And we think that a combination of going to peer-to-peer coaches in combination with accessing the modules that we'll share is a really cool way to tackle a way to gain expertise in these strategies. And we even have a module that's focused on how, once you've learned each of those strategies, how to integrate and embed them into academic instruction to make it a really seamless environment or seamless use of all those strategies all together. That module is called Embedding and Integrating Ci3T Domains into Daily Instruction and gives a how-to guide for doing integrated lesson planning. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment so that I can get my settings established to show you a quick video that's actually inside this module that gives an example for what integrated lesson planning might look like.
In this example of integrating academic, behavior, and social domains, imagine a teacher who is designing an academic lesson where students work in teams to explore measurement using fractions. The teacher set up the learning environment for students to conduct experiments using a variety of tools. Although this is primarily an academic task, the teacher stops to think about behaviors and social skills needed to successfully navigate the team activity. The teacher considers the school-wide behavior expectation matrix in the column for the classroom setting and determines 2 expectations and routines connected to them fit with this shared activity. Then the teacher considers the school-wide social skills curriculum and determines students need 5 of the previously taught social skills to engage in a successful, productive team collaboration. By integrating these into the lesson plan in advance through pre-correction, reteaching, and reinforcing, the teacher can promote behavioral expectations and social skills for students to engage in a positive, productive, safe learning environment. For more information, visit ci3t.org.
There are many other videos in that module that show similar examples of a specific lesson and how the teacher embeds and integrates those low intensity supports into the lesson, which is really kind of inspiring when you think about it and can start trying to say, okay, how can I make that work in my classroom? As you're thinking about learning more about the low intensity supports, inside this and other modules, you'll find this accordion that's like a really quick reference point for what each strategy is, like just a quick definition and an example of that strategy. So this kind of lets you take a shallow but comprehensive look at all those strategies. And then, of course, there's an entire module that will go deep in terms of getting that into place in your classroom. And in this module, we wanted to also feature one more video, which I think is really important. It basically shows how the low intensity supports aren't something separate from your normal instruction. They're really just part of instructional practices. And when you think about it, it's kind of actually, it's just good teaching. And when you see it in action, you can be really amazed at how efficient and effective a classroom can run when these low intensity supports are just embedded into all the interactions with students to help give that classroom a lot of structure and help students know just what to do. So I'm going to share this video before we move on.
Embedding low-intensity supports in daily instruction. It's almost time for the reading block in Mrs. O's class. As she begins to transition her students to the carpet, she uses pre-correction to remind them of the Lincoln Lion expectations she wants to see.
Okay, class, as you're moving to the rug for reading time, remember to show respect by going right to your square and keeping your voice at a level 1.
As she sends students off to their designated areas, Miss O actively supervises the transition by moving throughout the room and keeping an eye out for students who are following the expectations so that she can acknowledge them with behavior-specific praise.
Timmy, thanks for walking right to the carpet and sitting down. Sarah, looking good sitting crisscross applesauce in your own square. Thank you.
As she starts the lesson, Miss O uses pre-correction again to let her students know what she is looking for as they work.
Alright, as we begin to learn our vocabulary words of the week, I'm looking for students to give their best effort answering the questions asked. Please remember to exercise self-control also by raising your hand if you need anything and keeping your hands and feet to yourself. Let's get started.
Throughout the lesson, Miss O uses opportunities to respond with her students by having them hold up response cards to the questions she asks. She also uses pre-correction and behavior-specific praise to help them use the cards as desired.
Alright students, let's review our vocabulary words. I'll ask you a question and you will use your response cards to show me your answer. Once the question is asked, be responsible by keeping your response card in front of you when you show your answer. Okay students, hold up your green card when you hear the correct definition of the word habitat. A habitat is what an animal eats, the name of a baby animal, the natural home of an animal or plant. Oh, I saw a lot of green cards on that last one. That's right, habitat is a word we can use to describe the place where an animal lives in nature. For example, the habitat of an alligator might be a swamp, river, or lake. Hannah, thanks for staying in your square and holding your response card right in front of you for that question.
Embedding low-intensity strategies into daily instruction helps Miss O prevent challenging behavior from occurring and supports student engagement in the classroom.
Okay, so that's a cool video because it really illustrates how those low intensity supports can be fit into your daily instruction as just part of your normal flow. But really it can just provide a really profound impact on how students respond to that instruction and how behavior is supported by consistently using things like behavior specific praise and pre-correction. So hopefully that kind of inspired you a little bit to want to learn more. So what you can get, depending on which module you look at, is a brief introduction to those strategies through the Tier 1 Preventing and Responding to Challenging Behavior modules. Or if you want to go deep on each of those modules, there's one module per strategy. And when you open up those modules, what you'll find is the full ebook on pre-correction, for example, the interactive resource that's like a voiced over PowerPoint, and a whole host of infographics, videos, how-to guides, and other resources that you can download and use as you like. All of those are available to you right now as part of Project Enhance, and we would love for you to go and access the website and pull up one of those modules. And in fact, during the next talk time, we're going to give you an opportunity to do just that. But in each of those low intensity support modules, you'll find an infographic that looks just like this one on the left that breaks down what is the strategy, why you should use it, and how you should do it in a step-by-step fashion, which is super helpful. And I would just suggest you just go and download all of those infographics and just have them ready for you, so that when you're trying to plan your next lesson, you can say, okay, I want to use pre-correction. How do I do that? Or I want to use instructional choice. How can I do that? You'll also find videos that explain briefly what the strategy is and considerations for using those strategies, like kind of like a do's and don'ts kind of thing. All of those can be super helpful for getting these things into place in the classroom. You'll also find implementation checklists that basically walk you through that step-by-step process. And those modules have something that's called an interaction that basically gives you the full details of like, step 1 is this, and here's exactly how you do it. Which is really great. So that way you're not depending on someone else to come through and set this up for you, or, waiting for someone to do a professional learning. It's all at your fingertips, and you can kind of go at your own pace on learning those strategies. Additionally, we have treatment integrity and social validity checklists. We chatted before about what treatment integrity is. It's basically how well is this practice being put into place as planned. And we also have social validity checklists as well. So we would encourage you, as you're thinking about these strategies, especially when you're doing sort of the early learning phases of trying to put them into place in your classroom, collect some data on them on a daily basis and just kind of get a sense for like, hey, like this part is easy for me, but I could probably do a little bit better with this component or that component. It's a great way to be kind of your own coach, for example, and really get yourself to be an expert in these strategies. And potentially you could even ask an instructional coach or that expert that we talked about before in your building to come in and do like an observation and give you some feedback or tips for how to go sort of to the next level with that strategy. And if you're interested, we actually have a lot of resources for each of those strategies that can be shared with parents and families, like a step-by-step guide for translating that strategy to the home. So if parents are ever like, oh my gosh, I'm struggling with my child in terms of like a specific routine at home or doing homework at the home or anything like that, you could always provide these resources to them, which are available both within the modules and on the COVID tab of our website. And they're even translated into Spanish. So if you have Spanish-speaking families, they could certainly access those resources as well. And if you're intrigued by the idea of the low-intensity strategies, our next Empower session 3, is going to go deep on 2 strategies. So if you want to come and learn 2 specific strategies, we would love to have you at the next session. So we'd love for you to come to our 3rd Empower session to learn those strategies. And so next up, we're going to do an opportunity to select a low-intensity strategy to explore on our enhancingci3t.org website. All right, so we're going to jump into our 3rd section here, which is all about connecting students to Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. So one of the uses of screening data is to find students who might benefit from Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. So of course, in your school's Ci3T implementation manual, you've got your secondary Tier 2 intervention grid, which is like a catalog where you can go shopping for Tier 2 interventions. And then you've also got the same thing for Tier 3 as well. Now, as you're thinking about how to actually use those interventions, people often need training in Tier 2 and Tier 3 because it goes beyond what normally is done in the classroom. That's kind of the essence of Tier 2, right? Is we're doing something extra. And so as we're thinking about how to get people up and running on actually implementing those Tier 2 practices, we have resources on the Enhancing Ci3T website that you can actually use to learn how to go deep into those Tier 2 intervention strategies. So hopefully some of these actually map onto interventions that are listed in your school's intervention plans. And so one of the modules that we're going to feature here tonight is called the Tier 2 process, which talks about how to use data to connect kids to Tier 2 interventions and as well as Tier 3 interventions too, which really is kind of the essence of using systematic screening data to do this work. But within this module too, we give some conceptualizations for what Tier 2 really is and hopefully dispel some of the myths about what Tier 2 is not. And so if Kathleen were here, she would give you this cool analogy about like how Tier 2 in the gym, instead of having a separate gym where people that are less strong or less flexible, they have to go over here and do this whole other workout. That in a gym, a lot of times you have adaptive equipment that you can use to do similar exercises or adapted versions of exercise or the same squat, but just with less weight. And so everyone can work together in the same space, but work at their own level. And so really what Tier 2 and Tier 3 is a fancy way of saying, how can we adapt the environment to meet this person's needs without requiring them to go someplace else? So it's really a question of how can we maintain flexibility in the classroom to accomplish that? If you actually want to hear Kathleen give that talk, I'd love to just do it myself, but I don't have the charisma or the background in CrossFit to make that happen. But there's actually this video of Kathleen giving this speech at the Midwest Symposium for Leadership in Students with Behavior Disorders a few years ago. You can actually access that right there. There's a cut up version of that video in the module, which is pretty cool to hear. But inside this module, we give resources and supports to help people understand the structure of those tier 2 grids. So basically we take like the anatomy of a tier 2 grid and we break it apart and say, okay, what this grid is going to tell you is the name of the support. You're going to get a description of the support and possibly some links to resources on how to learn how to use it. But what's really interesting is the school-wide entry criteria. So like what level of risk on the screener would a student need to have for this to become an intervention we might consider for a student? Or what combination of risk factors in academic, behavior, and even attendance might a student need for this intervention to be a good idea? And then it also is going to list some progress monitoring data that we should consider, including keeping track of student outcomes. Like, how do you actually progress monitor a behavioral intervention? There are answers in these intervention grids. And also resources to do treatment integrity and social validity assessment, because just like with tier 1, where we don't want to look at data by itself and say, well, students aren't improving, what do? We will first want to start with, how are we doing with implementation? Are we putting this into practice as intended? Are we implementing with high levels of fidelity? And then, troubleshooting from there. And also getting student and teacher perspectives on whether they feel like this intervention is appropriate. Because why would we choose an intervention that doesn't seem like it has high social validity? Okay, and then we also have this cool infographic that breaks down some of the misconceptions about tier 2. Specifically, we encourage folks to not use language around, tier 2 students, right? We always want to talk about in terms of the supports, because A, we're not into labeling people, and B, because when we really think hard about what tier 2 and tier 3 is, it's really about the environment being flexible to be individually suited to meet the student's needs, not about categorizing kids. Because when we start categorizing people, we're sort of putting labels on them that really aren't fair. And frankly, everybody has a little bit of extra need in some domain in their life. It just so happens that this student has a need in academics or behavior or social skills, or maybe all three. But we really want to focus on describing using language intentionally so that we're not creating these misnomers for students. Additionally, we want to clarify that tier 2 doesn't require an extra location or a separate interventionist. So we say it's really the support. It's not the person who provides the support, because we've talked about low intensity strategies. Those can be used as tier 2 supports, and those can be done by the teacher in the classroom. They don't necessarily require a separate behavior interventionist. Although sometimes you might have a behavior interventionist that's helping with the implementation. It's important to make sure everybody gets on the same page. So even if you have folks that are coming in to help with these interventions, it's important to make sure that teachers are involved in that process as well. So it doesn't feel like we're sending this kid out to get tier 2. It's like, no, we're all collaborating to do tier 2 together. So yeah, that infographic is pretty helpful for doing some of that clarifications. And then we offer some guidance in terms of how to actually look at your data to make these decisions to find those students that need tier 2 supports. So if you're trying to develop data fluency on the part of your colleagues, or if you yourself are trying to learn skills around identifying what data are available and how to use them, there's some pretty cool guidance that's contained in this like little interaction that's built into the module that'll walk you through the data that are available. And kind of get you set up at least with starting to think about how to use these data. And then what we think is really cool is we offer a few different ways that you might look at data relative to the students and the interventions that are available. So for example, if you were a second grade classroom teacher, this is a spreadsheet that's saved in Google Docs that you could copy from the module, and you could populate this with your whole class. And then you could say, okay, these are the kids that I know have needs in academics. And then by looking at those data, you can start mapping out and doing sort of an initial sketch of like, across my class, these are some of the interventions that I think I'm going to assign to this student and to this student and to this student. And basically it provides like a roadmap of the interventions that you might like to put in place for your class, which once you recognize, as you move down that, you might see that there are patterns, like groups of kids that we say, okay, I've got these 5 kids that have some externalizing or internalizing needs. I'm going to use behavior specific praise right here in the middle of that chart for these students. And by marking that off, I'm going to remind myself that when I'm giving instructions or when I'm walking around the class giving feedback to students, I'm honing in on those kids and I'm going to give them a higher rate of behavior specific praise. So it's not that we're doing something completely different for them, but we're going to give them a more intensive dose of some of those low intensity strategies. But we might also plug in some additional interventions as well. So for people who are just trying to like make a roadmap of like needs and potential interventions, we think this is a pretty cool resource that you could use for that purpose. And if you wanted to take a deep dive into using something like this in your class or in your school, there's a video that will show you how to copy this into your Google Drive, and then it will give you some examples for how you could set this up and actually use this for decision-making purposes. We also have this really great data dashboard that's like an example of what you might see in a really well-established, well-organized data system where you can see academic, behavioral, social, and even attendance data in the same place. So this is actually very realistic, curated data sets that you can look at and kind of play with, right? You can use these little filters and say, okay, show me the kids that are at moderate risk for reading and moderate risk for externalizing behavior. And once we kind of look at those like groupings of students, we can say, okay, I know I need to do remedial instruction for these kids, but also I need to keep in mind that they have behavior challenges too. So how can I do some like synergistic behavioral and academic interventions to make sure that that instruction is going to be well met? And then because this sort of is a sandbox for playing with data and thinking about how to make decisions, we actually worked with a principal in a school implementing Ci3T and had a prolonged conversation with her. And she kind of played with the data and said, you know, if I was looking at this with my team, I think I might do this or that, or I wonder more about this. And it's a cool conversation because it really gives you a sense for like how to look careful at these data and start thinking about what the implications might be in your school. So this would be a great resource to look at if you're a leader or just someone that's looking to build your data skills, because we think being exposed to these conversations is pretty helpful. And then, of course, in all of our intervention modules, we've got intervention grids that specify what the intervention is and talk about some of the entry criteria. We mentioned before that the function of the entry criteria and the data to progress monitor are to figure out, you know, who might this intervention be appropriate for and how can I monitor whether it's working. We don't want to just put a tier 2 intervention into place and say, I hope it works, and then come back in 6 weeks and say, how'd it go, right? We want to have real-time access to information for how implementation is going and graphs that are going to show whether students are responding. And so those intervention grids often give you some guidance for how to actually accomplish that work. And they'll even give you some information on when would we stop this intervention for a student. So those are called exit criteria, and they give you a sense for like, what is our end goal here? What kind of data would we look at to say, okay, we made it. We're going to fade this intervention away, see if they're still successful. And if they still need it, we'll bring it back. But we're going to, you know, we don't want this to be something that lasts forever. Tier 2 intervention should be support we install, and with the plan of taking it away once the student has developed the skills that they need to no longer need it. And that's going to be true of all kinds of different interventions, from social skill interventions to integrated reading and behavioral interventions. So this is one of our like favorite examples for what this sort of integrated decision making might look like. When we're thinking about kids that have combined academic and behavioral needs, we need to make sure that we're not just saying, oh, we got to provide remedial instruction to help their academic needs, but then ignoring the fact that they have these coexisting behavioral needs as well. So one example of what we might do is we might have a small group differentiated reading time where we're going to do targeted instruction for skills that we know those students need more help with. But when those kids come to the reading table, we're going to use the self-monitoring form to help them stay maximally engaged to receive that instruction. So we're going to teach self-monitoring as a skill. We're going to teach them how to use a self-monitoring checklist. And then we're going to teach the expectations and hopefully set up this understanding on their part that, like, when I come to the reading table, I'm going to pay attention to my behavior. I'm going to pay attention to the academic instruction. And there's a reinforcement component as well, where if I accurately report my self-monitoring, I might get a ticket. Or if I meet my goal of 5 out of 6 of the components I've got a happy face on, I'll get a ticket or some sort of reinforcer at the end. Basically what this is it's a combined integrated decision or integrated intervention that's hopefully addressing the student's needs in a more holistic fashion. And then, of course, we're going to be monitoring treatment integrity, social validity, and student progress to make sure that we don't, again, just sort of set it and forget it and hope that it works, right? We're going to involve ourselves in data-informed decision-making throughout that whole process. We've given a lot of elementary examples. There are similar examples for middle and high school as well. Things like mentoring programs, targeted algebra classes, and the like. And if you're interested in seeing any of those intervention grids to kind of take a closer look at what examples might look like across those domains, again, this PowerPoint presentation is available on the enhancing ci3t.org, ci3t.org/enhance. And Stacy, if you'll put the password for that tab into the chat, that would be wonderful. So we've talked about the decision-making model for treatment integrity and social validity, and those resources are built into those modules as well. So if you're looking for checklists to monitor fidelity or questionnaires to assess social validity from student and teacher perspectives, all of that is built into each one of these modules, which I think is really cool. So for example, you can see right here inside one of the modules, there's like a table of contents, and there's a ton of downloadable forms and resources that you can use to get that intervention into place. And including infographics that go through the content. So as teachers are learning about self-monitoring interventions, for example, like in that last example for a reading intervention combined with self-monitoring, teachers can develop a complex and nuanced understanding of like, what does it mean to self-monitor our behavior and what do interventions like that look like? And then for leadership team members that are looking to build these interventions into their plan, we can find grids there to add to our tier 2 intervention grids. And we, of course, can use the modules themselves to teach folks about those interventions as well. So now we want to transition to tier 3, tertiary interventions. We do want to share some examples. The overall grid structure is very similar. It's the same structure as tier 2 interventions, but it's going to give us specific interventions we might try for those students with the most intensive needs. So one of those behavior interventions might be functional assessment-based interventions. And then the question becomes, again, how do we develop the skills to successfully implement those interventions? Because they are complex. They're the most intensive interventions that we have at our disposal. So we need to make sure that we're providing resources and training to folks on how to implement them successfully. Again, on the Enhanced tab of the Ci3T website, we've got quite a few resources that are available. And one of my personal favorites that we have is called Managing Acting Out Behavior at Tier 3, Building an Individualized De-Escalation Plan. We also have a supporting students with internalizing concerns at tier 3 module that really brings in important information about how do we bring in community mental health providers and collaborate with outside external agencies in the community to support students that have more severe or clinical needs in internalizing domains as well. And then our newest module is pretty cool because it goes into the science of reading and takes a deep dive at what intensive interventions might look like for academic skills, specifically reading, because we don't want to overlook the fact that it's not just about behavior, right? We want to make sure we have really intensive interventions to support students with reading needs as well. And then we'll leave you with, as we kind of get through this tier 3 section, that one of the best interventions at our disposal is the functional assessment-based intervention. We're working on resources that will go on the Enhancing Ci3T tab of the website to teach people about functional behavior assessment. But before those are available to folks, there are a lot of available resources to learn about FABI or functional assessment-based interventions. There's this special issue of the Beyond Behavior Journal that basically has several practitioner articles that basically outline an entire model for putting together a functional assessment-based intervention. And that model is taught on a tab on our website called Functional Assessment-Based Interventions that has an incredible treasure trove of videos and resources that guide a team of people doing this work all the way through the process of putting together a FABI to support a student with pretty severe behavioral needs. So if that's a need for you or for your school, I would encourage you to check out all the modules on the Project Enhance tab, but also take a look at that Functional Assessment-Based Interventions tab there as well. And then as we're looking to the future, in January and in March, we'll have 2 additional sessions that are going to go deep into tier 2 and tier 3 interventions. The session, I think it's session 5, is going to really go all the way into that managing acting out behavior at tier 3, building individualized de-escalation plans module that I mentioned was one of my favorites earlier. It's a really, really powerful module because it both teaches people to understand that major and explosive behavior doesn't just come out of nowhere. There is a predictable pattern that it follows. And if we understand that pattern, we put ourselves in a much better position to prevent it from occurring in the future. And we can be more empathetic to students when that does take place, because we can kind of see maybe what might have led up to it. And it gives a specific intervention model for putting together a highly individualized plan to support students who do engage in those pretty major peak behaviors, things like elopement and aggression, which is always a need for schools because those behaviors really do have a way of sort of changing the weather in a school. And even if there's just a few students that do those pretty significant behaviors, until there's a solid plan in place, they can be pretty disruptive to the school environment. So if you've got folks that need training on the acting out cycle, or if you want to come and learn about that, we would love to have you for those upcoming sessions, which will be coming up soon. Okay, so in our last section, before I open it up for any questions, we want to introduce a series of resources that are available that are sort of outside our normal Ci3T website. These are resources specifically around systematic screening. So I lied. There's one actual resource that's on our website that I wanted to show you before we jump in too far. These are called screening protocols, and they are extremely useful documents if you're just getting started with screening, or if you're looking for a procedure to help, especially people who are screening for the first time, to do so with procedural fidelity. So there's one that's called the site level screening protocol that basically gives whoever's leading the screening efforts at your school a how-to guide, kind of a step-by-step for how to make sure that that screening goes off without a hitch. Probably the most useful part of that protocol, it's all useful, but one of the pieces that's really important is on the second page of the site level protocol. There's a little box that basically gives the prompts that you might give to teachers at the beginning of screening. They're just simple things like make sure you screen across student by student instead of screening down behavior by behavior, right? It's really important to screen a whole student all the way across. And then simple prompts like to make sure that they hit save or upload or whatever it looks like in your system. So definitely check out the site level screening protocol if you're looking for a how-to guide to make sure that screening is done as intended. We also have this ebook that I mentioned earlier, and it's a really nice how-to manual that focuses on how to install screening in your school or district. And if that's something you've already done, you might not need that part of the manual, but it also talks about the interpretations of screening data, and it covers a lot of ground that we talked about today. So around that interpretation of first looking to see, do we need to focus on tier 1, or are we ready to look at tier 2 and tier 3? And then depending on that decision point, what some next steps might be. So this is a book that's available to you on the screening tab of the website. If you scroll down to the SRSSIE accordion, you'll find the, let's see here, the screening coordinator training manual, a guide for installing the SRSSIE in your school or district. You can download it as a PDF, or you can read that in your browser. And it's a pretty handy reference if you're someone that's leading the screening efforts in your school or district. And then the resources I wanted to share that are outside of the Ci3T website are on pbis.org. If you go to pbis.org, it's really an incredible warehouse of information and resources. Aside from the Ci3T website, PBIS is kind of my second go-to for looking for resources, particularly around behavior, of course. And if you went to the topics tab of their website and looked at database decision making, you'd find that there are a whole host of resources that are published by our team and others that address a couple of issues around systematic screening. So one of those issues is selecting a universal behavior screening tool. So if you're looking for which screener to use in your school or district, that's a very helpful brief to look at. If you're looking for information for how to interpret those data, there's another brief that goes specifically into that topic. And then there's one about installing. So picking the screener, interpreting the data, and actually getting it up and running in your district are the 3 topics that are available there. And then there's also briefs that are about talking to families about screening. This is a hot topic. You know, what state and local laws are from state to state can vary, but there are some general universal principles that you would want to share and discuss with parents, families, and community members to make sure that people are informed about what screening practices are and what they are not. And then also there is another brief about tips for communicating with your community about systematic screening. And this is for school leadership, so that they can be prepared to have those conversations with community members as well. And there are even more briefs that are guidance from like lessons learned, which are pretty cool, like easy to read narrative descriptions of districts that have gotten systematic screening up and running and used super successfully. I think one of the easiest ways to learn new information is by reading it in the context of a story, because you kind of get to hang on to the details a little bit more and see how things unfolded. So I think that's pretty cool. And there's some screening briefs that go kind of through that story at the elementary level and at the middle and high school level as well. So just to let you know what's coming up next on our Project Empowers, we talked about screening today. In the next session, which is going to be on November 28th, we'll have a low intensity supports focused module or focused event. It's going to be all about teaching low intensity strategies. So if you have colleagues, friends, other educators that are working in schools that are in Project Enhance, please invite them to sign up for that session. We think it's going to be a really important session because those low intensity supports really are the backbone of that Tier 1 experience. And then we have other sessions that focus on Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, all of which are available and you can register for right now. And yeah, just kind of coming to these sessions gives you the opportunity to build your own professional library of familiarity across all these practices across the tiers, and to come and ask questions and get a chance to put your hands on those resources as well. Some additional resources that are available to you if you have questions or want to reach out to our team. We have our Ci3T trainer and coaches calls that happen once a month. You can find the list of those calls on the professional learning tab of the website under Ci3T trainers and coaches. I think there's a link there that you can join the mailing group to get invited to those monthly sessions, which is just a nice, helpful touch point. If you have things that come up, throughout the course of a few weeks and you're like, I want to ask somebody a question about this as it relates to Ci3T, it's easy to pop onto those calls and just ask any questions that you might have. But yeah, we're now wrapping up our session 2 and looking forward to future sessions and encourage folks to join those future Empower sessions. And yeah, just to wrap up, we talked about screening today, specifically interpretations at Tier 1, the implications for using low intensity supports to modify and enhance Tier 1, and then connecting students to Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. And the next Empower session, as I mentioned, is all about learning low intensity strategies, and we're going to cover pre-correction, active supervision, and opportunities to respond.